when you sit in a meeting with Heinz and then you sit in a meeting with Oracle and then you sit in a meeting with Budweiser, you start to say, oh, okay, well, we're having similar conversations in all of these places. The products may be different, the challenges may be different, but ultimately it's about convincing people to do something. And so that kind of hit me at a very early age that, you know what, it's less about the industry, it's more about psychology and basic human nature in terms of like, how am I going to get people excited to do this? Buy a bottle of ketchup. That really sort of grounded me in my customer first sort of orientation, because I was like, if I can always figure out what motivates people, I think I could be pretty successful in what I do.
Welcome to FutureWorks, a podcast dedicated to the conversation around innovation within the workforce space. So we're here today to share research, inspiration, and a glimpse into what we're building and learning here at Aspect. And we get to do that with incredible guests like Lesley, who we have here today, who we'll introduce in a second. On FutureWorks, we dive into conversations with leaders, we scrutinize case studies, we nerd out on theories, dig into psychology, and really talk about and share what it takes to reinvent solutions within the workforce industry. I'm Gillian.
And my name is Michelle, and we are your hosts, leading you through these candid conversations about what happens in the world of work and how everything could just be a little bit better. So today, we're talking about corporate and authenticity. And I feel like those are two things that you kind of have to like force together, honestly. We've all been in that meeting where the two have collided and the authenticity from your corporation is really just said company delivering terrible news. I won't say that the two are opposing forces, like they aren't oil and water, but I think of them as a bit like ice cream and cheese. You have to work a little bit to get the combination to work. Like it takes a chef who knows what they are doing to bring these two things together with intentionality. And that, I think, is what Lesley is so incredible at, sort of this masterful blending of these two things, again, with intentionality. So we want to create spaces where all folks can show up safely and as themselves. And there's no one better in the world to dice up this topic with than Lesley. I don't even know, honestly, where to start with your background, Lesley. I could start with your work, which includes a resume that has MTV and Essence and Intel. I could talk about your drive for successful outcomes as you learn and grow with tools as they arise. I could talk about your creativity and your ability to grow and adapt, and how that has allowed you to be curious and solve pain points with thoughtfulness. However, we're not going to start with any of that.
Okay.
Because I want to start with food. Because I've already kind of led us down this path with ice cream and cheese and chefs. And because it is a universally human experience to eat and enjoy. I think nothing brings out authenticity more than a shared meal. So since eating is not really a great like podcast thing to do, I thought we would just talk about the best meal that each of us has ever had.
Oh, wow. Okay. So like
The hard-hitting question.
No, I don't know if you know this about me, but I'm literally obsessed with food. I love all things food. I love to cook.
Well, you live in Chicago.
Yeah, exactly. I love to cook. I love, I think about my meal the minute I finish the last one. It is such a central part of my life. And I can't agree with you more. It's how you connect with people. There's like a sense of ritual there. And it's just such a great way to explore other cultures. And a really easy way to sort of get your foot in the door. So you may have caught me off guard because I've had so many great meals.
It could be your the most recent incredible meal. I'll take that as well.
Okay. So last year, or maybe it was now 2 years ago, we went to Mexico City. And for those of you that haven't been to Mexico City, it really is sort of, I think, the food capital of the Western Hemisphere right now. I mean, what's going on in that city is just incredible when it comes to culinary prowess. And we happened to be there during ant season. And so we went out to this tasting menu that every single dish featured their delicacy of these black ants. And I'm definitely not one of those people who's like skittish about like trying exotic foods. My wife is, but we powered through, and it was such an interesting experience in this amazing, completely multi-sensory restaurant experience in Mexico City. And it was really great. Like every single course had antimatter in it, which was new for me. And it was surprisingly great. And just an end-to-end unbelievable experience.
That sounds incredible.
It was great. It was great.
That's fabulous.
I can say my favorite meal, it like ranks way up there. My husband and I took a kid-free trip to St. Lucia, and we like ended up at this like local street fair. It's like a street party, happens every Friday, and had the most, we had like a guy who was with us who was like, all right, this is like where all the locals go, and it has such great food. And so he's guiding us through. And I'll say up front that like I'm not a huge lobster fan. I currently live in a very landlocked state, so getting like seafood is a bit dicey. So I'm like, I don't know, I'll try this other fish. And then my husband got the lobster, and his lobster was the most incredible from this like side stand, just like outside, like so fresh and amazing. It was like the most amazing thing I've ever eaten. And then I was so mad at myself for not just like trusting the process and just getting the thing that I was told to get.
Right.
It's funny, Michelle, because mine involves lobster too. My answer to this question is the most amazing meal that I've had that I also want right in this moment in time. It's cold out. I need a warm soup, a little bit under the weather. I had this lobster soup in Iceland. And anytime someone says they're going to Iceland, I'm like, if you don't, I need you to get like, you know, when you're like, if you don't listen to me, I'm going to be kind of mad.
Right.
Like that's how I feel. And I had it at a high-end restaurant, and then I had it at like a fish store, a fish market. And it was kind of equally incredible. It was just presentation that changed, but it's this like tomato brothy biscuity soup with Icelandic lobster chunks in it.
Wow.
And
That
who
sounds
knows
delicious.
what else, but it's just, like the texture and the warmth, and I just need it right now.
I come from a long line of Black Southern female cooks in my family. And so my whole experience happened around in a kitchen, around a table, chopping stuff, making stuff. And so, you know, for me, both personally and professionally, like food is where I spend most of my happy thinking time. Whether it's like, what are we going to eat today? What am I going to make tomorrow? What restaurants do we need to go to? Where are we going on vacation next so we can find good places to eat? Like it is definitely a central force in my life.
I love it. Well, with that said, speaking of your life, we'd love for you to give kind of an intro, background, context for yourself, your professional experience, and kind of all the good reasons that we're here today speaking with you.
Sure. So I was born and raised in like Southeast Queens. And, you know, I was reflecting on this the other day. Both of my parents worked in, you know, public sector jobs. My mom was a school social worker. My dad worked for the city of New York in a myriad of different jobs. And, you know, I really early on, from like the minute I was born and could articulate any words, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. And that was sort of my dream until I got to Cornell University and basically looked around and were like, these aren't really my people, which sort of kicked off this sometimes self-destructive, but ultimately beneficial sort of journey of like, what am I actually here for? And what am I good at? Because I think when you grow up with like such a strong sense of like, well, this is what I'm going to be, compiled with like the youthfulness of I can make a plan and that's how things are going to go, to sort of have that ripped away, even though it was by choice, was really sort of disorienting and unmooring for me. And so I kind of floundered around, wound up leaving Cornell without a degree, And I had always been good with computers. And so this was, early 90s. And I got back to New York City, and a bunch of people had just started getting email addresses at work. I remember my last semester at Cornell was the first time we had to use email to check our grades. And so I had some friends who were party promoters, and I was like, oh, I wonder if there was like a way that we could send an email to everybody, which I know sounds really pedestrian today. But at the time, A, people were like, what's email? And B, there really weren't a lot of these tools. And so I went to the library because that's what I do when I'm struggling. And I was like, okay, well, I can learn how to program because I had a Commodore 64 and a VIC-20 back in the day, and I'd always been interested in computers. I spent a summer at MIT when I was in high school. And so I started teaching myself how to code. And all of a sudden, unbeknownst to me, it was like this internet thing started taking off. And in the mid 90s in New York City, the internet sort of business was very different, I think, complexion wise than it is today. It was much more what you would expect New York in the mid 90s to be. It was incredibly diverse. It was very arts based. It was much more of a cultural force, not necessarily a commerce force. But it was a really interesting time for me. And that experience of sort of getting in on the ground floor in that early sort of round of like the internet history allowed me to do a lot of things. I think because I was comfortable with the technology, I was able to sort of rise really fast in my career. And so by the time I was 26, 27, I was pitching, CMOs of companies like Oracle and the CEO of Heinz about building websites. And weirdly, I never was intimidated in those moments because naively, I was like, well, I know something that they don't. Otherwise, they wouldn't be bringing me into this room. And so I was able to find my footing and get that confidence, starting with, I know something that you don't. And that was a lot of sort of my currency as I was sort of, starting out early. I was the first person in the office. I was the last person there at night. I outworked, outshined, outperformed everybody that I worked with. And then eventually they made me a manager, and then I was like, oh shit. Okay. Like, this is not like what got me here is absolutely different than what's going to make me successful here. And actually, I don't know anything about what it is to be a manager, and I better learn quick. And so I was always really good with people. And I sort of tried to cultivate that as my superpower. I was the person in the office that everybody knew. I sort of knew like where you went to school and what your boyfriend's name was and where what your parents did. And like when people brought their parents to the office, I always made sure to sort of meet them because I like to understand the context for people. And so ultimately, this technology job got me into a lot of rooms that I probably would not have gotten into elsewhere. And it also sort of set me on this path of like, what are the differences and what are the similarities? Because, when you sort of sit in a meeting with Heinz and then you sit in a meeting with Oracle and then you sit in a meeting with Budweiser, you start to say, oh, okay, well, we're having similar conversations in all of these places. The products may be different. The challenges may be different, but ultimately it's about convincing people to do something. And so that kind of hit me at a very early age that, it's less about the industry. It's more about psychology and basic human nature in terms of like, how am I going to get people excited to do this? Buy a bottle of ketchup, switch their database platform from IBM at the time to Oracle, all of these different things. And so that really sort of grounded me in my customer first sort of orientation because I was like, if I can always figure out what motivates people, I think I could be pretty successful in what I do. And so that worked really well in the digital space. And especially at that time in the 90s when it was still new and still coming up. And I worked for a series of digital agencies in New York. But then 9/11 happened and sort of the whole digital industry kind of took a beat. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I had recently just left a job there were no jobs to be had. And a friend of mine was like, oh, well, why don't you help me? I'm working on this concert and like we need production support. And I was like, okay, well, I love music. Music is great. I'll totally do it. And it happened to be for Michael Jackson. And, he's Michael Jackson. And
casual. You just casually dropped that.
Right.
Like,
well, it's like, Michael Jackson today is kind of a little bit more polarizing, but back then, he was the biggest star on the planet. And, Taylor Swift plus Beyonce, if you can imagine that kind of insanity. Production was revelatory in a whole nother way, right? Because production is not about what you know at all. Yes, there are technical aspects to the job, but it feels very different than being in an office. It feels much more social. And I think working in production, and also entertainment tends to be, and this is I'm probably going to get angry comments about this, but entertainment tends to be, from my experience, less of a meritocracy than other fields. And so you had this dynamic in production where not necessarily the smartest people were in charge. And it felt the equivalent of like a high school lunchroom. Like it was very highly social. And in that moment was when I saw how the dynamics of how you can show up at work impact the final product, right? Because there was this insatiable desire for people to like cozy up to who were considered the cool people in production. And so what did that look like? Well, it looks like how it looks like in high school. People bully other people. People want to be down with like the cool kids. And there's this sense of like us versus them, or the in crowd and the out crowd. And, I was new to this, but I had sort of come in, even though I was a lowly PA, I had come in from one of the leaders of the production. And so I kind of got to see both dynamics. And I think what struck me the most during production was how many great ideas never even made it into the room because of that social hierarchy structure, high school lunchroom feel to the way that production the way that production in general seems to, sort of function. And it was fascinating to me. And I'll never forget, we were in a room and we were, talking about who should introduce somebody. And I can't remember who we were trying to find someone to be but I said, well, what about Graydon Carter from Vanity Fair? Because this was like when magazines were still big and he was like a cultural icon. And all these West Coast film and TV people were like, who's that? And I was like, huh. And it just kind of all fell into place. Like if you only live and sort of surround yourself with people that either are just like you or are trying to be you or mirroring what you're doing, like you just miss so much. And in today's business economy where it's a bloodbath out there for everybody, I don't think you'll talk to anybody in business today who does not think that these are some of the most challenging times. Obviously, everything is relative, but it is hard. Attracting talent is hard. Retaining talent is hard. There are so many different aspects that these interpersonal dynamics come into play, and you can't afford to not have everybody on your team showing up. Like you just can't afford to. Everybody is doing more with less. And if people don't feel like they can be themselves, then you're leaving manpower, brain power, innovation, all of these things on the table. And so, I think having that stark contrast, coming from early technology where it was so like, what do you know? What do you know? What do you know? And then sort of being dropped into this world that was like, who do you know? Who do you know? Who do you know? It gave me that opportunity to sort of like take a step back and be like, okay, neither of these feels perfect, but this who you know piece can actually be toxic. And so for me, it's always been about how do you, as a leader, lead by example in that authenticity at work, because you set the tone. Like if you're not showing up and bringing your whole self to work, your team's not going to do that. And so it's hard. because that authenticity sometimes gets mistaken for familiarity. It's sometimes harder to set boundaries with your employees. And I have found that those risks are worth it, because if you're mirroring authenticity and you're in a position of leadership and a position of inherent power, people will respond and mirror what you're giving them. And so that's kind of been really sort of one of my true norths as a manager.
I love that. And I think it's so awesome to have your kind of full background on like where your perspective comes from. Like that diversity of experience is huge because everybody's going to be coming from a different place. So having someone like you who has seen kind of, obviously not seen it all, but has seen such a different set of things is incredible. I think we get wrapped up in authenticity sometimes. Okay, I'll just tell this dumb story as an illustration. When I was in college, I decided, I don't know why, dumb, like when I went on like a kick where people would ask like, how are you? And I would just be like, well, I'm going to tell them exactly how I am. Like, I'm not going to say good. I'm going to say, exactly how I'm feeling. And I have this super distinct memory of this, like not a friend, like an acquaintance. We were passing on the steps of our student center and she was like, oh, hey, how are you? And I just was laid it all out. And she was like, okay, see ya. Right. So clearly that is not authenticity. So give us maybe a good working definition of like, what should we be thinking of when we're thinking about authenticity?
I was actually thinking about this in preparation for our conversation today. Sometime in like the past 12 to 18 months, DEI and everything that it represents has become sort of a taboo. And I feel that we're seeing a turn away from sort of the power of that conversation and the importance of that as a corporate feature. And so I don't want to define authenticity purely in a way that I think people tend to define it, which is, I am a Black gay woman and me showing up authentically is sometimes perceived as like me carrying that flag and sort of that being the core lead of like how I show up. And I don't know if that's it. I am not naive enough to think that there are companies where you probably can't show up authentically. I mean, we have companies that don't allow you to have dreadlocks. We have companies that force people to wear suits. We have, so companies do have their own culture. I think for me, showing up authentically is saying and doing the things that allow me to sleep well at night. And so that is, not letting someone continually talk over somebody in a meeting. That is not, that is not coming in at the last minute and being like, oh, this is all wrong, when I've had multiple times to weigh in before. Like it's broader than just me showing up as a Black woman. It is how I show up and do all of the aspects of my job and do them to the best of my ability with the tools and the information that I have. And to me, that's the real authenticity that we're striving for. And through that, obviously, my culture, my ethnicity, my sexuality is going to inform how I define those things. But I don't necessarily think that my authenticity is derived from those things, if that makes sense.
I like the theme here too around how your actions affect others directly. Defining it as something to help you sleep at night is such a good empathetic perspective on how you're influencing the environment around you.
Yeah. And it's not easy. I mean, there are definitely nights where I'm like, I met that person with frustration and anger. Because here's the thing, I'm doing this class right now called Positive Intelligence. And, one of the lessons they teach you is like everybody has a judge, and, you judge yourself, you judge others, and you judge the environment. And, I am naturally a judgmental person, because I think that was a tool I learned very early on to survive as an only in a lot of different situations. And so at that point, my superpower was like, okay, how quickly can you size up this situation and determine how safe it is? And that's being judgmental, right? And I guess now I'm learning that judgmental comes with negative emotions versus being discerning, which is the ability to parse out information without the negative emotion, right? So if somebody on my team is not performing, judgment is when I get angry about that. Because it's like, I shouldn't get angry about that. There's nothing to get angry about. It's okay. This person is not performing. Why do I think that is? And what are the steps necessary to move forward? They're not doing it to me. There's no reason for me to be angry about it. And so I could be discerning and I could be forceful without the judgment layer. And that's and I fail at this more than I get it right. But one of the things they tell you on this platform is to like catch your judge and celebrate when you catch it. And so the idea is that I'm going to continue to judge people, but then I'm like, you know what? That's your judge. You shouldn't do that. Like, not you shouldn't do that, but like, watch that. That's your judge. That's not your voice. That's your judge's voice talking. And like, you can be discerning and still get to where you need to be. And so, that's to me, like how it works from an interpersonal dynamic and how I try to show up at work is to like remove the negative emotion component for the fact-based, insights and things that I'm seeing, right? So it's nothing is good or bad. It just is what it is, so to speak. And so that's been really helpful for me because, I think when you're a type A person, it's hard to understand non-type A people. And for me, very early on a manager, I was like, well, I don't understand. Like, why don't they want to work as hard as I do? Or what? Like, my goals are not everybody else's goals. And sometimes in service of the greater goal, which is a certain business outcome, it's my job as a manager to find out their goals and figure out how this job helps them with that and continue to remind them of that synergy. And if that synergy is ever not there, then have the courage and the relationship to be like, hey, maybe this isn't the right space for you. Not because you're underperforming, but this is clearly not aligned with your goals. And those are really hard conversations to have. But if you've been actively managing your team through like personal and professional goals tethered together, it's an easier conversation to have.
What I heard from your intro of yourself is that like you so naturally show up with kind of this posture of like, what can I learn from this? Like, how can I take this and apply it kind of broadly across my life? For a manager or anyone showing up at work who maybe doesn't naturally already come with that posture, kind of maybe teach us about like, how do we do that like active management? Like, I think as we were thinking about this topic, I was thinking about creating a safe space, right? For in your corporate world. So how can we kind of do that active management so that we are creating safe spaces? Like, what's a good starting point for someone who's never experienced that?
Yeah. Well, pardon me for like the cliches, but like I kind of bristle a little with safe space. I prefer brave space because I think safety means that. Like, safety kind of feels like there's no chance for people to be hurt. And I'm not sure hurt or pushed, I should say. And I'm not sure that meaningful change can ever happen in truly safe spaces. I think brave spaces to me are spaces that you can say hard things in that people may not want to hear, but that everybody in that space knows that the intention coming in is not malicious in intent, which could make it a safe space, but I think it's a little bit broader than that. And I think for me, it is like, so how I do it in groups is different than how I sort of do it every day, like when I'm sort of going about my day. I think in groups and in organizations, it's really, 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 really important to have the rules of engagement defined, discussed, and documented of how we are going to behave in meetings and also understand like what as a group or a team we deem acceptable, right? And I know a lot of managers do this in a lot of different ways, but I think having that as a collaborative group conversation, so everybody as best you can has at least the opportunity to voice their perspective, because I think buy-in in organizations is essential, especially when you're looking at people that are under 35 in the workforce. I think this sense of bringing people along is vital to ensuring that everybody's with you when you get there. So like I know managers, for example, that always have the most junior person in the room start with feedback, because to my earlier point, if I go first, then people are maybe likely to parrot what I'm saying. And also, if I go first, other people may be more intimidated to speak. So when I've had really young teams, I've always been like, okay, what did you think about what we just saw? And some people don't like the calling on thing, but by me starting with the younger folks or the people that were more junior in the room, one, it gave them an opportunity to speak up, and also allowed me as their manager to see kind of how they think. But then they could also see, okay, well, the person who's one level above me answered it this way. And then here's Lesley's take on top of that. And, I now can see where maybe I didn't think about all of these different aspects. I think there is something to experiential learning. And I think that being in those types of environments where you have to sort of speak your mind, I know introverts find that horrible. And I've been trying to rack my brain to figure out how to, create that same dynamic, but for people who just don't like speaking up, but like that's an easy way to sort of shift the dynamic, because I bet if you go to most meetings, the most senior person always is, it's like the seniors that are always talking. The senior leadership's always talking. I know other people that, will do sort of, office hours or do have those types of tactics where people can come in and, just drop in and have a conversation, and start to build those relationships in another way. I think, from a personal perspective, for me, I just never stop asking why or how. And that's, it served me well, because people also don't have any shortage of wanting to tell you why and how. And so, so you never get like, a roadblock, because people like to talk about themselves. And I think what I like to do is like make sure that I go into those meetings prepared. Like there's so much information out there, that there's really no excuse to go into a conversation with anybody without being prepared. You can find them on LinkedIn. You can find them on their social handles. You can read about their company. You can read about their job title and what that may mean in other places. And so I think that combination of engaging people and literally asking them, how did you get here? What are your goals? Like, how did, asking people how they got to their path in life always is insightful. And so I think when you start to have those conversations, I think people share. And again, it's that mirroring effect. If I'm sharing, then other people will share. And once you have that modicum of connection, and it could be over sports or it could be over food, or, oh my God, you know this person, I know that person. Oh my God, you went to high school in Long Island, so did I. Like, then it's a lot easier to sort of have a hard conversation with that person, because they understand a little bit more about you. And they understand like, okay, this is a person just like me. And I think sometimes that is really lost. And I have a lot of theories on why I think that's lost. I think, when you look at the difference between female leaders and male leaders, I think female leadership is much more inclusive in that emotional way. And so I think when you look at sort of American business, I think part of the reason why it is kind of where it is because the over-indexing of males in leadership positions. I think men are starting to understand that, but I think historically women, I think, have just been pushed to be more of the nurturer caregiver role, which I think is one of the most underrated skills as a business leader. Because I have had jobs where most of my days felt like I was the den mom more than the financial executive or the analytics guru or the marketing lead. It was like managing my team and making sure that this person who broke up with their boyfriend is okay. And this person who, is struggling to learn this thing with this new analytics platform is okay. And like dealing with their anxiety, it's a lot of that. And I think that surprised me as well when I first became a manager, because I was like, oh, like I now need to be a therapist too. Cause like people are going to come in and tell me things that are absolutely not related to work, and I'm like, oh, okay. And so I need to understand how to have those conversations too. And, I'm a big believer in therapy. I think if you go to the gym, you should do the same thing for your mind and your soul. And so I work with my therapist. Like we talk half the time about my life and we talk the other half about work, because it is where you're spending most of your interpersonal relationship time is with your people at work. I mean, I spend 8 hours a day with these people. If I'm lucky, I get 3 hours with my daughter and maybe 4.5 hours with my daughter and my wife, And so there's a lot of psychological investment in these people because I'm with them all day, every day. So, so it's important. It's important to not neglect that part of the office culture and the office ecosystem, because if you do neglect it, you'll see it in turnover rates, unhappy employees, people leaving. And, not that I'm all for people making less money, but like there are studies that show that if your employees are happier, that in and of itself is another form of compensation. And, I think now more so than ever, there is a real, like, is this worth it? Like, do I really want to be with people I hate all day? And most people under 35 are quickly saying no.
Yeah, I'm curious. So when you're interviewing someone for a role, let's say you've got the person who's highly qualified to just get the job done. And then there's the person who you're more likely to connect with on a personal level. And they are incredible, but they don't have the technical experience, but you trust them and you would, I'm kind of leading you to an answer here, so maybe I should just stop. But can you tell me what you would do? I'm actually in this situation right now.
If you are smart and capable, I could probably teach you what you need to know to be successful in the job. What I can't teach you, or what I probably don't have the time to teach you, is like how not to be an asshole, how to get along with others, like how to be more additive than what you're bringing to the table. I like to hire people that fit the culture and then worry about the minutia of like, okay, are they, level 4 trained in, Sigma 6 or whatever thing they need to be trained in. But, I have found, and also I've been the beneficiary of people taking a lot of risks on me. When I made the switch from internet to like .com to production, ultimately that landed me at MTV Networks at Spike TV. But, Albie Hecht, and Casey Patterson, who brought me on, like, I did not even know the first thing about cable television. But they were like, you are smart, you are a good culture fit, like we can teach you TV. And they were like, and we could teach it to you in like 2 days because it's actually not that hard, And so I was like, okay, well, if you guys think I could do it. And I think that, it's interesting because moving from New York to the Midwest, New York is very much feels much more like a culture fit kind of place. Like you could be really successful in New York without the credentials if you can find business cultures that fit yours. And so when I moved to Chicago, in my 40s, like I still struggle with this because Chicago to me feels more like a, what type of place. And, I do not have an MBA, and I feel like, sometimes that's held against me. Whereas like in New York, I feel like people be like, oh, wow, okay, you've done all these things. Like, we're not worried that you can actually do the job. We want you to sort of see how you're going to fit in with like the vibe we're trying to create. Whereas here, there seems to be a lot more focus on like, okay, can you check all the boxes? And it's just been an interesting thing to notice. I think, I want to make the statement, but I don't have enough data points that I think that probably is steeped in the fact that the Midwest has a lot more family-owned businesses that have grown up into corporations that have a different sort of culture, whereas like our coasts tend to be more innovation centers that sort of appreciate and I think are seeking out that diversity of thought, obviously only to a certain level, because I think it's still under 2% of VC funding is for, funders of color or women. So they're not actually going that far out of their comfort zone. But like, I think the idea of innovation and the idea of diversity of thought seems to be way more ingrained in corporate culture on the coast than what I'm seeing so far here in Chicago. Obviously, these are broad generalizations, but I think there is a little bit of that difference. But innovation, you need that diversity of thought.
I'd love to kind of go back to some of what we were talking about in regards to the brave space, especially, with authenticity in the back of our minds, empowering others to be authentic. I'm curious if you have advice as to how to kind of contribute or create a brave space as a leader.
Mm-hmm.
But then a second version of that question is as someone who is being led. So we refer to them as doers, those that are supporting the leaders. We really want to make sure that while we're thinking through these scenarios, we're giving a wide breadth of folks actionable kind of insight that they can take away from this and apply to their jobs.
I would say the first thing to do is like look in the mirror and really evaluate yourself on how well you know your team. And I think, yes, it's about, okay, what are their spouse's name? Do they have kids? Do they have dogs? It's about that. But like, and a lot of people do this. They'll do, Myers-Briggs, or they'll do sort of those sorts of tests that kind of give you a macro level. But I think really understanding what makes your team tick and what makes the individuals, what are they motivated by? Where do they just really assessing them all and figuring out, like, am I one of those managers that thinks about these things or am I not? And so that's like the first step, because I think a lot of managers kind of have this like, oh, I hope they don't come and talk to me about like personal stuff. Like God, cause it is an uncomfortable, navigation. And so I think starting with like, how well do I know my team and like truly know my team?
I'm curious, like, how does that actually work in your day to day? Like, let's say you hired someone, you got to know them on a personal level in the interview-ish. So, some little bits. Are you kind of making that your priority out the gate and kind of your main focus in your interactions with them, getting to know them, or is that happening over time? And then additionally, like when you're connecting with them in a meeting, are you spending 15 minutes? It's a 45-minute meeting. Are you spending 15 minutes kind of shooting the shit? I'm just curious.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So that granular. Okay. So I always ask whenever I'm interviewing somebody, like I think my two last questions are, what are the best thing and worst things that everybody that you worked with would say about you? And then the last question I usually ask is, how do you spend your time when you're not at work? And the way people choose to answer that question tells me so much about who they are and how they motivate. Because some people are like, oh, I don't really do anything. And I'm gonna be completely transparent. That is a hard no for me, dog. Like, if that is how you're answering that question, that is a hard and fast pass from me.
Yeah,
because
red flag.
It's an interview and like you should be putting your best foot forward. And B, like, if you can't tell that I'm like oozing with curiosity and like and have that sort of curious energy, then you're probably not the type of person who's going to do well on my team. So I start right out of the gate, and I always ask in interviews, like, tell me about how you were, and it's hard because HR is always like, oh, you can't, and I'm like, tell me about your upbringing. How did you get to this place? Oh, were you born and raised in the city you lived in? How did you get, like asking those questions? Obviously, I don't want to be too intrusive. But then I usually, I have one-on-ones with everybody on my team. Usually it's about, I would say 15 to 20% of our one-on-ones are usually talking about personal stuff. What'd you do over the weekend? Have you planned your vacation? You know, cause like I'm the vacation person, like, oh, have you planned your vacation? Where should you go? And then we'll talk about like where they want to go. Oh, I've been there, you know, and it's like different things. So it's stuff like that. It's, you know, I'm obsessed with Reddit. And I have one of the women on my team is like this avid cyclist. So like I will see something that I think she might like. Oh, they're doing this like really interesting road trek in the Pyrenees. Shoot her a link. Hey, I saw this, you know, because I think I think managers forget what it was like to be a non-manager and how much like of a boost it was when you felt recognized by your manager. And so to have an unsolicited personal, like Lesley is out here on a Saturday thinking about where I should be spending my next vacation. She may not articulate it in that way and she may not see it in the moment, but over time, it becomes undeniable that like she actually does take an interest in me. And so that's sort of how I practice it as a manager. And I'm intentional about it. And I make sure, you know, if it's a Friday meeting, you got any plans this weekend? Doing anything great? I also am an oversharer. This year, I have fallen in love with the Sphere in Las Vegas because I love live music. And so my team was treated to a constant barrage every weekend I was in Vegas of like me in front of the Sphere, like, you know, like, like that. And that's important too. Like, I am not just about work because sometimes at work, I'm not going to be nice and I'm going to have to say hard things. But like, that doesn't mean that like, I also don't have fun. And also sometimes I'm mad at corporate and sometimes I'm like, I hate working for the man. Like I am just like you, you know? And so I think that reciprocity around like being curious and also sharing. And I think for every manager, figuring out where that line is personal, you know, like I think for me, growing up as an only in so many spaces, I have found that answering questions helps diffuse ignorance. And so I would rather answer the question if you have a question about me being Black or me being lesbian than having you sort of out here making up your own shit and stories about what that experience is like. Not everybody feels that way. A lot of people I've met who are Black or gay don't want to be your educators if you're not conversant in those topics. And so it isn't a monolith. People are very different. And I think you have to be respectful. Some people are like, no, like, I'm not going to go there with you. I don't feel comfortable with that. And that's their right. And so if you don't want to get into those heavier things, like we started today, food is a good one. It's innocuous. Music can be innocuous. I happen to hate pop country. So that would be a deal breaker for me. Real country I love, but pop country I have no patience for. But like, is it music? Is it food? Is it a sports team? Is it geography? Is it the best place you want on vacation? There's so much that you can connect with. And so I think as a manager, that is your work to do. I don't think you can expect your employees to sort of drive that culture change. I think as an employee, I think it is trying to replicate that with your peers, right? And so it is a lot scarier to try to forge a relationship with your boss that it feels, but like you can test and learn that with your peers in your work group. Because I also think there is a lot that as managers we don't see because we aren't sort of on all the emails or in those meetings. And especially when we were in the office, I was in my office most of the time and my team was out in cubes. And so like, you don't necessarily see that dynamic. And so I think one, doing those same things with your peers, being curious about who they are, figuring out how they work best looking at yourself, being like, how do I work best? Understanding and identifying those potential landmines. We all work with that person who you're like, if there is one person we can get rid of, I wish it was that person. And that person may or may not be going anywhere. And if they're not, you got to sort of figure that out. So I think like doing that same work with your peers, I think if you feel comfortable having those conversations with your manager about, I don't know whether or not I would say showing up authentically to your manager, but you can also be the person that solicits information. And so, like, for example, when I was in my 20s and 30s, I would always make sure that I had like skip level informational meetings with different people in the organization. So not my manager, their boss. And I would just be like, hey, do you have like 30 minutes? I'd love to sort of hear about how you got to where you want to be. And it's scary and it's hard that first time. And the worst thing they could say is no. They're not going to say no. They may say, I'm busy right now, but follow back up. But like, you got to stick with it. And ultimately, like I said, people like to talk about themselves. And so, and the more successful, the more they like to talk about themselves. And so, you can be that catalyst as a question asker of management. And I think you would also be surprised, because it is human nature to mirror, that may trigger a change in management. And if people see you doing it, whether it's your peers or your manager, they may do it as well. And so I don't think, I think it kind of looks the same. It looks like being inquisitive. And if you're not the type of person who can do it face to face, that's the beauty of email. Do I think it's as effective? Probably not. But if you're an introvert and like, there's nothing worse than like sitting across a desk or in a Zoom call with someone who's 2 levels above, maybe it is an email, or, maybe it is another way for you to connect. So I'd say that that's probably my advice to both doers and managers is, that inquisitiveness, the how, the why questions, the, truly being curious about where you're spending 8 hours a day leads you into a more authentic place. Because I think sometimes a lack of authenticity is a result of a lack of critical thinking, right? So like, I'm not I haven't thought this all the way through. So therefore I can be malleable, and so being prepared is another pillar of that authenticity that I'm talking about. And so the more questions you ask, the more by nature reflective you'll be, and you'll move from a less malleable, like, I don't care about this, to, oh, no, like, that isn't right that guy keeps talking over this woman in this meeting. Or no, that isn't right that like he's making, he's like imitating this person's accent, and then you can start to feel a little bit more like, okay, you know what, that's actually not right. And, we know that it takes that one person to say that's not right. And then everyone's like, you know what, you're right. That isn't right. Mm-hmm. And so that reflection and inquisitiveness gets you to firmer ground on how you feel about behavior. And so that's where I would start for both.
What's something that someone could walk away from this conversation and take action on in the next 5 minutes? Like, I just listened to this podcast. In the next 5 minutes, what is the next action step you would give? I
would say find someone in your office that you've never spoken to and start a conversation with them, or make the intention to do it. Reach out, put time on their calendar, because a lot of people aren't in offices. But I think that would be where I would start. There are a lot of people who are in marketing who wish they were in strategy, or who were in strategy and wish they were in here, or in HR and wish they were in legal. And like, just that alone, it's like, okay, we'll find someone in the legal department and just say, okay, I'm in HR. I have no idea what you guys do. What does your day look like? I'm curious. I'm fascinated. It's a really easy conversation. If you're not one of those people who feels comfortable speaking up all of the time, the observation piece is still important. And then maybe it's an email after the meeting, or an email to someone who's your extrovert buddy who'd be like, okay, you know what? I didn't want to say anything in the meeting, but did you notice that so-and-so was talking over so-and-so? Like, how did you feel about that? And it's maybe you do that in a smaller way and get the extrovert like myself who's willing to pick up the charge for anybody. It's fine to be like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, I mean, that's why we're here. We are here to sort of amplify our introvert friends. And so like, there's ways to get around that. But yeah, I think the observation and the small, conversations is a good place to start.
It's almost made me miss more than I realized the physical side of being in an office, which I didn't think I longed for. I'm just curious, Like, do you have any off the cuff tips on how to truly get to know people? Like, how have you changed how you are doing all of this in a remote world?
So I got hired at my most recent job at Intel remotely during the pandemic. And I think it was 7 months before I met my boss in person. I think it was maybe 18 months before I met anybody on my team in person. And, it is definitely harder. And while I love working remotely, it has definitely made that aspect of the job harder. I have sort of found that I have not figured out how to replicate the water cooler hallway passing, sitting on the end of the desk thing. But I tend to kind of see these meetings like the same way that I saw meetings in person. And so like even on our Zooms, one thing that Zoom has enabled us to do is see actually inside people's homes, which in and of itself is like, what better gift could you ask for when you're trying to understand who people are than to see their space? And so I'm always like, I don't know if you guys followed that. It was big in the height of the pandemic where they used to rate the background guys.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm always like, is that a Ta-Nehisi Coates book on your bookshelf or, those sorts of things. And so I think that you can still replicate that. I think if you guys are geographically safe and you're a manager and you have the budget to do it, I think, that would be something that I would be ramping up, or like, how do I get people together in real life? But I think it's hard to do. I remember when the pandemic first started, it was like the Friday Zoom happy hours and Kahoot trivia games. And that kind of feels a little forced. It can bridge the gap, but when you should probably try to bring people together. Or if you're like one of those offices where you got like a bunch of people here and a bunch of people there, figuring out how to get them together, but it's hard. It's definitely hard. And I understand, even though I don't like it, the return to office sort of conversations that are happening, because when I think of like many times when I've been a part of something truly magical, it has been a bunch of people in a conference room with whiteboards and, that sort of real timeness that is hard to replicate. And so, hopefully the tools will get better for really being able to replicate that. Like we tried to do it with like the Oculus and do it in like Meta. And that was kind of not the same, but it was better than Zoom. That is a big challenge for us to consider. And I think it'll be interesting to see once the data comes out in 20 years, 30 years, whatever, whether or not there was sort of a lull in innovation during this remote work phase. And my bet would probably be there is. And so we'll see how this plays out, but I'm fascinated to see, whether or not there is actual value in being in person. And I'm hoping that people smarter than me are studying this.
Yeah. I mean, I started my career at a kind of old school ad agency, and the amount of ideas that landed that were kind of passed from someone sitting at a desk with their feet kicked up on the desk, and someone over here, and like somebody's like passing a ball.
Right.
And like
right.
that was the idea. We got the idea. We got what we needed.
Right.
It's just so hard to replicate that.
It's so hard to replicate that. Yeah. Or someone walks by your screen and is like, oh, why don't you do that? And you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Like, I mean, there's so many moments in that agency, like creative pit where like someone walk by and be like, oh, you know what? It would actually look better if it was like this, or maybe, bring down the saturation. And like, so it's interesting. Yeah.
You know what tool has really, for my world and my team, has changed the game is Figma for us. Because you can watch people work and not in an annoying way. You can, there's like a cursor chat. So you can be working on the same document together, building some creative or product screens. And you can have a dialogue back and forth while the work is happening in real time. But the other thing I'll say is in terms of tools, for whiteboarding, Fig Jam
Fig Jam,
has
yeah.
been so it's been the closest experience I can get to kind of nailing it virtually.
Yeah.
We're not sponsored, but we could be.
Well, I mean, I mean, maybe you guys you'll have other experts that come on, but like the tool adoption piece is infuriating. Because, like, yes, you're right. Figma is great.
Listen,
Figma is great. If you can get people to use it. Well, we can use it, but like getting everybody rowing in the same direction on tools is like the bane of a modern manager's existence. Exactly.
We need a psychologist, though,
yes,
to help us manipulate people into using the tools.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Yeah, we got to start doing internal sales. Like, please, can you just Slack me this message?
Right.
Please.
I want to say I'm really proud, and Michelle has witnessed this, but our team has been trying to get the sales team off of PowerPoint.
Oh, good luck with that.
Because it's actually, I think we're about to get somewhere, and we're going to use, again, not sponsored, Figma slides, because like, you can have such a talented designer try to make a PowerPoint look sexy. It's literally never going to happen.
Right.
It's never going to happen. And we need to just dial things up a bit. But yeah, getting people up. The PowerPoint transition is the bane of my existence.
Yeah. I can see that. I can totally see that.
Well, this has been so amazing. I appreciate the way that the conversation kind of shifted toward kind of more managerial type perspectives, because it's so actionable. It's great to hear your strategies and your approach and the way you look at managing. It's not a skill we're all born with, but it's part of growth, whether one likes it or not. And I think that the perspective you've shared is enlightening and inspiring and motivating for us to kind of just try more, do more, say more, ask more, and kind of break the barriers. We don't have to be so operational and robotic with our team to keep them productive.
And you also don't have to drive the conversation. We all know this. Well-placed, well-articulated questions can move anything forward.
Yeah. Just let them go.
Let it go. Exactly.
Let them run wild.
Exactly. So you don't necessarily have to lead. You just have to, be the catalyst. And that starts with a question.
Lesley, thank you so much for our time. And everyone listening, thank you for listening to FutureWorks. Please subscribe and follow along as we continue.
Thank you guys for having me. This is great.